Imagine opening your eyes one morning and realizing the world outside your shelter is silent, white, and brutally cold. There are no cities, no roads, no familiar comforts. The ground is frozen solid, the air burns your lungs, and survival depends entirely on what you do next. This is not a fantasy world. This was daily reality for people who lived during the Ice Age. Life in this world was not about adventure or heroism. It was about routine, endurance, and constant calculation. Every day began with the same question: how do we stay alive until nightfall? Food, warmth, shelter, and safety were never guaranteed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Even small mistakes could mean the end. In this video, we will step inside that reality. Not myths, not exaggerations, but what daily life actually looked like. How people woke up, stayed warm, found food, raised children, and made it through ordinary days in an unforgiving world. If you enjoy deep, realistic history that slows down time and explains how people truly lived, like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us which part of ancient daily life you want explored next. Now, let's wake up in the Ice Age and live one full day the way they did. Waking up in a frozen world was not dramatic, heroic, or mysterious. It was slow, uncomfortable, and immediately demanding. People did not open their eyes to adventure. They opened their eyes to cold that had never fully left their bodies, even during sleep. The first moments of the day were not about thought or planning, but about sensation. Stiff joints, numb fingers, breath visible in the dim air of a shelter. Survival began before anyone fully woke. Shelters were not houses in the modern sense. They were temporary structures shaped by necessity and environment. Some were made from animal skins stretched over frames of wood or bone. Others used packed earth, stone, or snow as insulation. None were perfectly sealed. Cold always found a way in. The goal was not warmth, but reduced exposure. Even a small difference in temperature mattered. Sleep itself was light and fragmented. People did not sleep long, uninterrupted hours. Bodies shifted frequently to maintain circulation. Children slept close to adults. Shared warmth was essential. Waking during the night was normal, especially to adjust coverings or tend to a low-burning fire. Morning arrived not with comfort, but with the realization that the fire had weakened and needed attention. The first task of the day was restoring heat. This was not optional. Without warmth, fingers lost dexterity, tools could not be handled properly, and the body burned energy too quickly. Someone, often whoever woke first, carefully fed the fire. Fuel was precious. Wood, dried grass, or other burnable materials were never wasted. Flames were kept small but steady, enough to warm the air slightly and bring life back into stiff muscles. Only after warmth was stabilized did the day truly begin. Food was not immediately available in the morning. There was no breakfast waiting. If anything had been saved from the previous day, it was eaten sparingly. Hunger was normal. People were accustomed to starting the day without a full stomach. The body adapted to this rhythm over time. Energy came from conservation rather than abundance. Morning routines focused on preparation. Clothing and coverings were checked and repaired constantly. Materials wore down quickly in harsh conditions. Tears and skins or loose bindings could become dangerous later in the day. Simple tools made from stone, bone, or wood were inspected. A cracked edge or loose handle could not be ignored. There were no replacements waiting elsewhere. Every object mattered because every object represented time, effort, and survival. Before anyone left the shelter, the environment was observed. Wind direction, cloud cover, and temperature shifts were noted instinctively. These observations guided decisions for the entire day. A sudden change in weather could turn a routine task into a life-threatening situation. People learned to read subtle signs in the sky and landscape, not as a skill taught formally, but as knowledge absorbed from childhood. Daily life did not follow strict schedules, but it followed priorities. The first priority was maintaining the shelter and fire. The second was assessing food needs. The third was deciding whether conditions allowed movement. Some days, leaving the shelter was too risky. On those days, survival depended on stored materials, repairs, and patience. When conditions allowed, groups prepared to move outward. Movement was cautious and deliberate. No one wandered aimlessly. Energy was conserved. Steps were measured. The cold punished unnecessary motion. Even walking too fast could cause sweating, which became dangerous once movement stopped. Clothing was layered and functional. It was not decorative. Every layer had a purpose: insulation, wind protection, moisture control. Adjustments were constant. People removed layers when moving and added them when stopping. Comfort was secondary to regulation. Children were integrated into daily life early. They observed, carried small items, learned through watching rather than instruction. Childhood was not separate from survival. Skills were absorbed gradually, through repetition and presence. Finding food was the central concern of every day, but it was not always dramatic. Much of it involved patience, observation, and routine. People searched for signs: tracks in snow, disturbed ground, patterns in animal movement. They also gathered what the environment allowed: roots, preserved plant matter, anything edible and safe. Nothing was dismissed casually. Food acquisition required cooperation. No one survived alone for long. Groups shared information, labor, and risk. Success was collective. Failure was also collective. This reinforced social bonds built on necessity rather than choice. The cold shaped behavior continuously. Hands lost feeling quickly. Tools were harder to grip. Speech slowed. People communicated efficiently, conserving energy. Silence was common, not because of fear, but because talking required warmth and breath. Midday did not mean rest. It meant reassessment. Bodies were monitored for signs of exhaustion. Fingers were checked for numbness. Exposure was limited. If conditions worsened, plans changed immediately. There was no stubborn adherence to earlier decisions. Flexibility was survival. Returning to the shelter was as important as leaving it. The day was structured around making it back before conditions became more dangerous. Darkness increased cold and risk. Shelter represented safety, even if it was uncomfortable. Evening routines mirrored morning routines. Fire was strengthened. Food, if available, was shared carefully. There was no overeating. Reserves were protected. People understood that tomorrow was never guaranteed to be easier. Social interaction increased in the evening, not for entertainment, but for coordination and emotional stability. Stories, gestures, shared silence. These reinforced group cohesion. Stress was managed collectively. Isolation was dangerous. Sleep came gradually. Bodies relaxed only slightly. Warmth was arranged carefully. Children were positioned between adults. Fires were reduced, but not extinguished. Someone always remained partially alert. This was not a harsh life in the sense of constant panic. It was harsh in its consistency. The same concerns repeated every day: cold, food, shelter, safety. There were no days off from survival. What defined daily life was not suffering, but awareness. Every action mattered. Every mistake had consequences. Comfort was rare, but routine provided stability. Waking up in this world did not feel extraordinary to those who lived it. It felt normal. It was the only world they knew. And surviving one ordinary day was already an achievement. Once the shelter had been stabilized and the body had warmed enough to move without stiffness, the day entered its most demanding phase. Life in the Ice Age was governed by a single overriding reality. Energy was finite, and every action had to justify the energy it consumed. People did not think in calories or measurements, but their bodies and instincts were finely tuned to this balance. A successful day was not defined by how much food was found, but by whether more energy was gained than lost. Leaving the shelter was never automatic. Even after waking and warming, people waited. They watched the sky. They felt the wind. They listened. Weather conditions determined everything. A slight change in wind direction could mean harsher cold later. Heavy cloud cover could signal snow. Clear skies could mean extreme cold. Decisions were delayed until the environment gave enough information to reduce uncertainty. Movement began slowly. There was no rush. Rushing burned energy and increased risk. The first steps outside the shelter were careful, allowing the body to adjust to the cold air. Breathing was controlled. Sharp breaths could shock the lungs. People learned to inhale slowly, warming the air before it reached the chest. Travel through the Ice Age landscape was physically demanding even without carrying tools or supplies. Snow, ice, frozen ground, and uneven terrain forced constant adjustment. Every step required attention. Falling was dangerous. Injury could not be treated easily. A broken bone or deep cut was often fatal days or weeks later, not immediately. Avoiding injury mattered more than speed. Groups moved together for safety and efficiency, but not closely packed. Spacing allowed better visibility and reduced noise. Sound traveled far in cold air. Silence was not fear-based, it was practical. Communication relied on gestures, brief sounds, and shared understanding built over years of living together. Hunting, when it occurred, was not constant pursuit. Most of the time was spent reading the land. Tracks in snow were examined carefully. The age of a track mattered more than its size. Fresh tracks meant opportunity. Old tracks meant wasted effort. People learned to estimate time by subtle details. How sharp the edges were, how much snow had fallen since, whether wind had softened the impression. Animals were not chased recklessly. Chasing wasted energy. Instead, people relied on patience and knowledge. Animals followed predictable patterns, migration routes, feeding grounds, resting areas. Hunters positioned themselves strategically, using terrain to their advantage. Frozen rivers, narrow passes, deep snow, and slopes were all tools. Weapons were simple but effective when used correctly. Stone points, wooden shafts, and bindings required constant maintenance. Tools were checked before use. A loose binding or cracked edge could mean failure at a critical moment. Repairing tools was as important as using them. Large animals were not hunted every day. The idea that Ice Age people constantly hunted massive creatures is misleading. Such hunts were rare, dangerous, and energy-intensive. Much of daily survival came from smaller game, scavenging, and gathering whatever edible resources the environment offered. Gathering required deep environmental knowledge. Frozen roots, preserved plant matter, and seasonal resources were identified through experience. People knew where to look even when nothing was visible on the surface. Digging through frozen ground was exhausting and done only when the potential reward justified the effort. Energy conservation governed posture, pace, and timing. People leaned into the wind to reduce exposure. They rested briefly in sheltered spots. Rest was not relaxation, it was strategic recovery. Resting too long increased cold risk. Resting too little caused exhaustion. Balance was constant. Sweat was dangerous. Overexertion could soak clothing, which then froze when activity stopped. People regulated effort carefully, removing layers while moving and adding them immediately when stopping. Clothing management was continuous, not occasional. When food was found, the work was far from over. Processing an animal in freezing conditions was slow and difficult. Fingers numbed quickly, tools slipped. Fatigue set in, but nothing could be wasted. Meat, fat, bone, sinew, and skin were all valuable. Fat was especially important, providing dense energy and insulation benefits. Transporting food back to shelter was one of the hardest tasks of the day. Loads were heavy. Balance was harder to maintain. Fatigue increased injury risk. The return journey demanded focus when energy was lowest. Many accidents occurred during return, not during the hunt. If the day yielded little or no food, the response was not panic. Scarcity was expected. Portions were reduced. Stored resources were used carefully. Emotional control mattered. Anxiety wasted energy and clouded judgment. Children were present during these activities whenever possible. They were not shielded from hardship. They learned by watching how adults moved, waited, decided, and stopped. Survival knowledge was absorbed gradually, embedded in routine rather than instruction. As daylight faded, priorities shifted immediately. Darkness increased cold and danger. No opportunity was worth being caught far from shelter after sunset. Even promising situations were abandoned if return could not be guaranteed. The journey back was quiet and slow. Bodies were tired. Attention narrowed. Shelter represented safety not because it was comfortable, but because it reduced uncertainty. Reaching shelter marked the true success of the day. What defined Ice Age daily life was not constant danger, but constant calculation. Every choice balanced effort against reward. Survival favored patience, restraint, and awareness over strength or bravery. This rhythm repeated endlessly. Some days brought success, others brought hunger, but the structure remained unchanged. Secure warmth, seek resources, conserve energy, return alive. Living through one ordinary day required discipline, knowledge, and cooperation. There was no space for carelessness. The environment punished mistakes without malice or mercy. This was not a life of excitement. It was a life of attention, and attention was survival. As daylight faded from the frozen landscape, the world of the Ice Age narrowed into something smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous. Evening was not a moment of relief. It was the point in the day when survival became most uncertain. The cold intensified rapidly as the sun dropped, and the human body, already exhausted from hours of careful movement and labor, began to lose heat faster than it could produce it. Every sound changed. Every shadow lengthened. Every decision now carried heavier consequences than it had during the day. The return to shelter demanded complete focus at the exact moment when the body wanted to stop. Muscles stiffened quickly once movement slowed. Fingers lost sensitivity, making balance uncertain. Snow that had been manageable earlier hardened into uneven, slippery ground. Ice became invisible. Familiar paths could no longer be trusted. A single misstep could mean injury. An injury in the Ice Age was rarely something a person recovered from. It was not the pain that killed, but the loss of mobility days later. Many lives ended not during dramatic hunts or confrontations, but quietly, during this return, when exhaustion dulled awareness. Reaching shelter did not end the work. It only changed its nature. Survival tasks continued immediately. The first priority was always heat. Fire was not comfort. It was not symbolic. It was a biological requirement. Without controlled warmth, the human body burned energy at an unsustainable rate, weakening itself for the following day. Fire had to be managed with care. Flames were kept low and steady. Large fires consumed fuel too quickly and risked drawing animals. Fuel itself was precious and gathered over many days. Nothing burnable was wasted. The process of rewarming the body was slow and deliberate. Sudden exposure to strong heat caused pain and could worsen cold injuries. Hands and feet were warmed gradually, often using body heat before approaching the fire. People understood their physical limits through lived experience. They recognized the difference between numbness that would fade and damage that would not. This knowledge came not from instruction, but from observation, repetition, and loss. Clothing required constant attention. Ice Age clothing was layered and practical, made from animal skins, fur, sinew, and plant fibers. These materials trapped warmth, but also trapped moisture. Moisture was dangerous. Sweat produced during movement froze once activity stopped. Any damp clothing had to be dried as much as possible, even if only partially. Sleeping in wet layers could lead to hypothermia, even inside shelter. People treated dryness with the same seriousness as warmth. Only after heat and clothing were stabilized did food become the focus. Eating was never emotional. It was measured and restrained. Portions were calculated against uncertainty. Even after a successful day, overeating was avoided. Experience had taught discipline. Tomorrow could bring nothing. The body might crave more, but survival depended on control. Food was shared according to survival logic rather than fairness. Children, the injured, and the weak were prioritized. Strong adults accepted smaller portions without protest. Conflict over food was rare not because hunger was absent, but because cooperation was essential. Everyone understood that individual survival depended entirely on the group remaining functional. Fat was the most valuable part of any food source. It provided dense energy and helped maintain body temperature. Fat was consumed carefully, often in small amounts. Bones were cracked for marrow. Organs were used when possible. Nothing edible was discarded. Waste was not a concept that existed in daily life. As food was consumed, exhaustion settled in deeply. Muscles loosened slowly. Limbs felt heavy. Thoughts narrowed. This was not comfort. It was depletion. People did not resist it. Rest was necessary to survive the next day. Fighting fatigue wasted energy and increased risk. Evening was also the only time when psychological pressure could ease slightly. During the day, attention was outward, fixed on terrain, weather, and movement. In the evening, attention turned inward. People processed fear, loss, success, and failure quietly. This was not done through long conversations, but through proximity. Sitting close, sharing warmth, and shared silence stabilized the group. Stories, when told, were practical. They carried warnings, memory, and instruction. They reminded listeners of dangers, mistakes, and successful strategies. Silence was equally important. Silence conserved energy and allowed the mind to rest. Children learned most during these hours. They watched how adults handled hunger, disappointment, injury, and fear. Emotional control was learned through observation. Panic wasted energy. Despair weakened the group. Calm endurance was survival knowledge. As darkness deepened, vigilance increased. Visual awareness disappeared, replaced by listening. Sounds traveled farther in cold air. Animals became more active at night. Any unfamiliar sound triggered alertness, not panic. Fear was controlled because panic increased danger. Sleeping arrangements were planned carefully. Children were placed between adults. The injured or weak were positioned closest to warmth. Fire was reduced, but never fully extinguished if fuel allowed. Someone always remained partially alert. Deep, uninterrupted sleep was rare. Sleep came in fragments. Throughout the night, bodies shifted to maintain circulation. People woke often to adjust coverings or check the fire. Dreams, if they occurred, were brief and broken. Cold prevented complete relaxation. This fragmented sleep was normal and accepted. Night represented vulnerability. Injury, illness, or sudden weather change could become fatal before morning. This knowledge shaped behavior profoundly. People learned humility before the environment. Control was limited. Adaptation was everything. As the fire dimmed and bodies rested, the group entered a fragile balance. Survival was never guaranteed. Morning was never promised. Yet life continued because attention, discipline, and cooperation made survival possible. As the night settled fully over the Ice Age world, time seemed to slow, but danger did not. Darkness removed distance and direction. What could be seen during the day now had to be imagined, and imagination was never trusted. People relied on sound, memory, and habit. Every small noise mattered. A shifting wind, snow falling from a branch, the distant movement of animals. Each sound was evaluated carefully, not emotionally. Panic wasted energy. Calm observation preserved it. The cold deepened steadily as hours passed. Fire became the quiet center of life, watched constantly. Its size was adjusted with precision. Too small, and the body lost heat too quickly. Too large, and fuel disappeared too fast, leaving nothing for later in the night or the following morning. Someone always remained partially awake, even while resting. Full sleep was a luxury that rarely existed. Survival demanded awareness. Bodies responded to the cold in predictable ways. Circulation slowed. Extremities numbed. Muscles tightened during stillness. People shifted positions frequently, even while sleeping, to maintain blood flow. These movements were automatic, learned over years. Stillness for too long could be dangerous. The body needed motion, even minimal, to remain functional. Illness and injury were most feared at night. During the day, movement and activity kept circulation flowing. At night, the body's weaknesses became more apparent. A minor injury that had been manageable earlier could worsen. Swelling increased. Pain intensified. Infection, though not understood scientifically, was recognized through experience. The body's response to wounds was watched closely. Any sign of worsening condition altered plans for the following day. Children slept lightly, often waking when adults shifted. They were kept close not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Fear was learned early, but it was controlled. Children observed how adults reacted to uncertainty. Calm behavior shaped calm responses. This emotional inheritance was as important as physical skills. Weather changes were especially dangerous at night. A sudden shift in wind direction could drive cold air directly into shelter. Snowfall could increase rapidly, threatening collapse or blocking exits. People listened for changes in sound that indicated these shifts. Adjustments were made immediately, even if it meant interrupting rest. Survival did not pause for comfort. Animals posed a constant background threat. Most avoided human shelters, but hunger could override caution. The smell of food, fire, or bodies carried in cold air. People were alert to unfamiliar sounds beyond the shelter. Weapons were kept within reach, even while resting. Defense was rarely dramatic. The goal was deterrence, not confrontation. Noise, firelight, and group presence discouraged most threats. The psychological weight of this existence accumulated slowly. Ice Age people lived without long-term certainty. There was no concept of guaranteed future stability. Life was measured in days, sometimes hours. Yet this did not produce constant despair. Instead, it shaped a mindset focused on immediate reality. Worry beyond what could be acted upon was minimized. Attention was conserved like energy. Night was also the only time when memory had space to surface. During the day, survival demanded action. At night, the mind revisited losses, close calls, and past mistakes. These memories were not indulged emotionally. They were examined for lessons. Memory was a survival tool. Forgetting danger was more costly than remembering pain. As the night progressed, fatigue deepened. Sleep came in brief intervals. The body never fully relaxed. This pattern was normal. It shaped physiology over generations. Human endurance adapted to fragmented rest. Survival favored those who could function under constant low-level exhaustion. Toward the final hours before dawn, cold reached its peak. Fire fuel was lowest. Bodies were weakest. This was the most dangerous part of the night. People remained alert, knowing that surviving until first light mattered more than comfort. Dawn brought visibility, movement, and renewed options. When light finally returned, it did not bring relief. It brought responsibility. Those who had survived the night now faced another full cycle of effort. Bodies were stiff. Hunger returned immediately. Cold remained. But survival had been achieved one more time. This was the rhythm of Ice Age life. Day and night were not opposites. They were connected trials. The end of one did not mean rest. It meant transition. Survival was continuous, unbroken, and demanding. Living this way did not feel extraordinary to those who experienced it. It felt normal. It was the only life they knew. Comfort was not expected. Stability was measured in mornings reached, not futures planned. And waking after the night meant the process would begin again, exactly as it had before, with no guarantee that the next cycle would be survived. From the earliest moments of life, Ice Age humans were shaped not by choice, but by necessity. Survival was not something learned later. It was the environment into which people were born. There was no separation between living and learning, no protected stage where mistakes carried no cost. Even infancy unfolded inside a world that demanded constant adjustment, awareness, and restraint. Children were not raised with the expectation of comfort or self-expression. They were raised with the expectation of awareness. From the moment they could move independently, they were already participating in the survival system of the group. This participation was not symbolic. It had real consequences. Where a child stood, how they moved, when they spoke, and when they remained silent all mattered. Boundaries were established early and enforced consistently. These boundaries were not abstract rules, but physical limits shaped by danger. Certain areas were safe, others were not. Wandering away from shelter, fire, or adults exposed a child to cold, injury, or animals. These dangers did not wait for explanation. They acted immediately. As a result, caution became instinct long before reasoning developed. Learning happened through exposure, repetition, and correction. Children watched adults constantly. They observed how tools were held, how movements were minimized to conserve energy, how clothing was adjusted instinctively as conditions changed. No one explained efficiency. Efficiency was demonstrated thousands of times each day. Inefficient behavior produced discomfort or risk. Efficient behavior produced survival. Mistakes were not treated as moral failures. They were treated as hazards. A poorly tied binding broke. A careless movement led to a fall. A failure to manage clothing resulted in cold stress. These outcomes were immediate and memorable. Learning occurred quickly because the environment enforced it relentlessly. Emotional behavior was shaped as carefully as physical skill. Fear was not suppressed, but it was controlled. Children learned early that panic disrupted coordination and wasted energy. They watched how adults reacted to danger without excessive movement or sound. Calm was not praised. It was expected. Emotional restraint became a survival trait. Children were exposed to injury and death early. Loss was not hidden or softened. This did not create cruelty. It created realism. Life was understood as fragile and temporary. This understanding did not diminish its value. It intensified it. Relationships were practical and deep, formed through shared survival rather than sentiment. As children grew, their responsibilities expanded naturally. Carrying, gathering, watching, assisting, these tasks increased with physical ability. There were no ceremonies marking adulthood. Competence itself marked transition. A person became valuable not by age, but by reliability. Adolescence was not a time of rebellion. It was a time of increased expectation. Strength increased, and so did responsibility. Young individuals were expected to contribute meaningfully. Independence was encouraged only when it improved group efficiency. Recklessness was discouraged through consequence rather than punishment. The group functioned as a single organism. Individual behavior affected collective survival. A person who consistently wasted energy, ignored environmental signals, or acted impulsively posed a threat to everyone. Social correction occurred subtly. Tasks were reassigned. Independence was reduced. Trust was rebuilt through consistent behavior, not argument. Elders held a different form of authority. Physical strength declined, but experience accumulated. Memory became their value. They remembered past winters, failed strategies, animal behavior shifts, and environmental changes. This memory guided decisions. Groups that retained experienced members adapted better than those that did not. Knowledge transmission was constant and silent. Skills were not taught once. They were practiced endlessly. Tool-making, shelter maintenance, clothing repair, fire management. These were daily activities. Children learned by doing, under supervision, until competence emerged. There was no concept of wasted time. Every action had purpose. Idleness increased cold exposure and risk. Movement was intentional. Rest was strategic. This rhythm shaped behavior deeply. Ice Age societies did not survive through strength alone. They survived through discipline, memory, and cooperation. Individual desires were secondary to collective stability. This was not ideology. It was enforced by environment. And for those born into this world, this structure did not feel restrictive. It felt normal. It was the only way life worked. As Ice Age communities endured season after season, the pressure to make correct decisions shaped every layer of social life. Choices were rarely personal. They were collective because consequences were collective. Where to move, when to move, who would lead, who would stay behind, and how long to remain in one place were questions that affected everyone. These decisions were not debated endlessly. Debate consumed time and energy. Instead, decisions emerged from experience, observation, and quiet agreement shaped by trust. Trust itself was earned through consistency. A person who repeatedly judged conditions accurately, conserved energy, and returned safely from tasks gained influence. This influence was informal but powerful. Leadership was situational rather than permanent. The individual best suited for a particular challenge guided action in that moment. Authority shifted fluidly as conditions changed. This flexibility allowed groups to adapt quickly without internal conflict. Disagreement existed, but it was restrained. Open conflict weakened cohesion and increased risk. When disagreement arose, it was resolved through action rather than argument. If a proposed approach failed, it was abandoned. If it worked, it was repeated. Success validated behavior more effectively than persuasion. Failure corrected it. Scarcity tested social bonds constantly. Periods of hunger were inevitable. During these times, cooperation became even more critical. Food sharing was not equal, but strategic. Those whose survival was most essential to group function were prioritized. This logic was understood and accepted. Resentment served no purpose. Survival required clarity, not fairness. The group's tolerance for repeated endangerment was limited. An individual who consistently ignored signals, wasted resources, or caused injury forced the group to adapt around them. Tasks were restricted. Supervision increased. In extreme cases, separation occurred, not as punishment, but as survival calculus. These situations were rare, but they existed. The environment allowed little room for repeated failure. Adaptation was continuous. Ice Age environments were not static. Weather patterns shifted. Animal migrations changed. Resources disappeared and reappeared unpredictably. Groups that clung rigidly to old routines suffered. Those that adjusted survived. This adaptability extended to social structure. Roles evolved as needs changed. Care for the vulnerable was pragmatic. The injured and ill were supported as long as support did not threaten group survival. Decisions were difficult and unromantic. Compassion existed, but it operated within limits imposed by reality. Survival demanded honesty about those limits. Children absorbed these dynamics without explanation. They watched how decisions were made, how mistakes were handled, and how responsibility was shared. They learned that survival was not about individual strength, but about reliability. Being dependable mattered more than being bold. Over time, this system shaped behavior deeply. Impulsiveness diminished. Awareness increased. Individuals learned to read subtle environmental cues and social signals simultaneously. Survival required both. A person who ignored either endangered themselves and others. Memory played a critical role. Past failures were not forgotten. They were referenced implicitly in future behavior. Routes avoided, strategies abandoned, and habits adjusted based on experience. This collective memory functioned as a guide more reliable than instinct alone. Emotion was regulated through routine. Predictable sequences of action reduced anxiety. Knowing what came next, even in harsh conditions, provided stability. This stability allowed people to endure prolonged uncertainty without psychological collapse. Life expectancy varied widely, but survival favored those who integrated fully into the group's rhythm. Isolation, whether physical or behavioral, increased risk. Belonging was not sentimental. It was functional. Over generations, these patterns refined themselves. Behaviors that worked persisted. Those that failed disappeared. Culture emerged not as art or ritual, but as accumulated survival strategy. What endured was what allowed people to wake up again. In this way, Ice Age societies sustained themselves across immense spans of time, not through dominance over nature, but through continuous negotiation with it. Humans did not overcome the Ice Age by force. They survived by learning how to exist within its limits. For those living inside this system, it did not feel extraordinary. It felt inevitable. It was life shaped by cold, scarcity, and cooperation. And this collective discipline, quiet, adaptive, and relentless, was what allowed human beings to endure a world that offered nothing freely. Movement in the Ice Age was never treated as a neutral act. It was not seen as progress, exploration, or choice in the way modern people understand movement. To move meant to accept danger deliberately. It meant leaving behind familiarity, known shelter, known terrain, and known patterns of survival. Yet despite this, Ice Age people moved again and again, not because they wanted to, but because remaining still often became more dangerous than the risks of travel. The decision to move did not happen suddenly. It formed slowly, accumulating weight over time. People noticed when familiar animal tracks no longer appeared, when hunting required longer travel for smaller returns, when fuel sources were depleted closer to camp, and when weather patterns shifted in subtle but persistent ways. None of these signs alone forced movement. Together, they created pressure. Staying meant exhausting resources completely, and exhaustion left no margin for error. Discussions about movement were quiet and restrained. There were no dramatic arguments or declarations. Decisions emerged through observation and shared understanding. Those with experience spoke little but were listened to carefully. Memory mattered. Someone remembered a past winter when staying too long had ended badly. Someone else remembered a route that had once provided shelter. These memories guided action more than optimism or hope. Once the decision to move became unavoidable, preparation dominated daily life. Every object was evaluated not by usefulness alone, but by weight, durability, and necessity. Carrying capacity was limited. Bodies already worked at the edge of endurance. Extra weight increased fatigue and injury risk. Tools were inspected carefully. Anything broken or unreliable was either repaired or discarded. There was no room for redundancy. Clothing required special attention before movement. Travel increased sweating, and sweat increased danger. Layers were adjusted to allow movement without overheating. Repairs were made to prevent heat loss during rest. Foot coverings were reinforced because foot injuries during migration were especially dangerous. A person who could not walk slowed the entire group. Food preparation before travel was meticulous. Portions were calculated to balance weight against energy needs. Carrying too much slowed movement. Carrying too little increased risk. Food had to survive cold, movement, and handling. Fat was especially valuable, but heavy. Decisions about what to carry were difficult and final. Children transformed migration into a fundamentally different experience. They could not move at adult pace. They required frequent stops. They could not regulate body temperature effectively. Carrying children limited flexibility and speed, but abandoning them was unthinkable. The group's future depended on them. Movement was adjusted entirely around their needs. The presence of the elderly created similar constraints. Experience and memory were invaluable, but endurance declined with age. Groups faced constant calculation, how to preserve knowledge without sacrificing survival. Routes were chosen to minimize extreme terrain. Movement slowed deliberately. Patience replaced urgency. The physical act of travel was exhausting beyond what stationary life demanded. Snow and ice forced constant adjustment. Frozen ground punished missteps. Carrying loads strained muscles continuously. Even standing still required energy. Rest stops were brief and strategic. Stopping too long increased cold exposure. Moving too long caused dangerous sweating. Navigation relied entirely on environmental memory. There were no fixed paths. People recognized landforms, wind exposure, vegetation patterns, and animal behavior. Losing direction was catastrophic. Groups avoided unnecessary detours, even when they suspected resources nearby. Certainty was valued over possibility. Temporary shelters during migration were inferior to established camps. They offered less insulation and less protection. Fire was harder to maintain. Fuel was scarcer. Nights during travel were the most dangerous nights of all. Fatigue accumulated quickly. Sleep was shallow and fragmented. The group remained alert even while resting. Weather was unpredictable during movement. Sudden wind shifts increased exposure. Snowfall could slow progress dramatically. People adjusted plans constantly, sometimes reversing direction or stopping entirely if conditions worsened. Pride had no place in these decisions. Survival required flexibility. Fear was constant but controlled. Unfamiliar terrain carried unknown risks. Animals behaved differently outside known ranges. The group relied heavily on cohesion. Cooperation was tested under fatigue. Disagreements were minimized because conflict consumed energy and fractured trust. Despite all of this, migration was unavoidable. Ice Age environments changed continuously, remaining still guaranteed eventual failure. Movement was not an escape from danger. It was an extension of survival over distance. It carried its own risks, but those risks were sometimes the only remaining option. As days of travel passed, exhaustion reshaped priorities. Progress slowed. Rest became more frequent. Decisions became increasingly conservative. Reaching a new location mattered less than arriving with the group intact. Survival favored restraint over ambition. This was the reality of Ice Age movement. It was not heroic. It was not adventurous. It was calculated endurance undertaken because the alternative was worse. As migration continued, the risks that had been theoretical at the beginning of the journey became immediate and unavoidable. Fatigue accumulated in layers. Muscles that had been strong during the first days of movement began to weaken. Small strains turned into persistent pain. Blisters formed and split in the cold. These were not minor inconveniences. Each physical problem altered pace, posture, and energy use, increasing the chance of further injury. The longer movement lasted, the narrower the margin for recovery became. Loss during migration was not rare. It did not always come suddenly. Sometimes it unfolded slowly, over days. A person who struggled to keep pace fell slightly behind. Extra effort was required to assist them. That effort drained others. The group faced constant recalculation. How much could be given without endangering everyone? These decisions were not cruel, but they were relentless. Survival demanded clarity, not sentiment. Children suffered most during prolonged movement. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. Their energy reserves were limited. Carrying them strained adults already under load. Stops were frequent, but every stop increased cold exposure. Parents and caregivers adjusted constantly, balancing movement against warmth, speed against safety. Crying was dangerous, not emotionally, but practically. Sound traveled far in cold air. Comfort had to be silent and efficient. Illness spread more easily during migration. Close contact, exhaustion, and cold weakened resistance. A simple sickness that might have been manageable in a stable camp became life-threatening on the move. The group watched carefully for signs of weakness, slowed movement, confusion, loss of appetite. Decisions had to be made quickly. Delay increased risk. Navigation errors carried severe consequences. A wrong turn could lead into terrain that consumed energy rapidly or offered no shelter. Backtracking wasted precious strength. People relied heavily on those with the strongest memory of land and seasonal patterns. That was dangerous. Certainty, even imperfect certainty, was safer than hesitation. Animals reacted differently to moving human groups. Some avoided them entirely. Others followed at a distance, drawn by scent or weakness. The group remained alert constantly. Weapons were kept ready, but confrontation was avoided whenever possible. Defense consumed energy and risked injury. Deterrence was preferred. Weather shifts during migration were especially dangerous. Wind exposure increased dramatically outside established camps. Sudden storms could halt movement completely, forcing the group to build shelter quickly under poor conditions. These shelters were fragile and temporary. Nights during such pauses were among the most dangerous moments of Ice Age life. Psychological strain intensified as movement continued. Uncertainty grew. Familiar landmarks disappeared. The future felt compressed into the next few hours rather than the next season. This mental pressure tested group cohesion. Small irritations could escalate if not controlled. Emotional discipline became as important as physical endurance. Leadership during migration was fluid but critical. Those who judged conditions accurately gained influence. Those who made mistakes lost it quickly. Authority shifted without ceremony. The group followed competence, not status. This adaptability reduced conflict and improved survival chances. When migration succeeded, it did not feel like victory. It felt like relief. Reaching a new area that offered shelter, fuel, and food did not end hardship. It reset it. Energy reserves were depleted. Bodies needed recovery. The group had to rebuild routines from nothing. Success was measured not by arrival, but by how many arrived able to continue. When migration failed, it failed quietly. Loss was absorbed into routine. The group adjusted and moved forward. There was no time for extended mourning. Survival demanded continuation. Memory of failure informed future decisions, shaping routes avoided and strategies abandoned. Migration shaped Ice Age societies profoundly. It favored flexibility over attachment, memory over optimism, cooperation over individual ambition. Those who adapted survived. Those who resisted change did not. Over generations, this process refined behavior, eliminating inefficiency and preserving what worked. This constant movement through uncertainty defined Ice Age life as much as cold or hunger. Humans did not endure by building permanent stability. They endured by accepting instability as normal. In this way, migration was not an interruption to life. It was life itself, stretched across distance, risk, and time. In the Ice Age, the human body was never assumed to be stable, durable, or dependable. Survival did not begin from a place of strength. It began from the understanding that the body was fragile, constantly threatened by cold, exhaustion, and damage. Injury and illness were not exceptional events. They were expected conditions that shaped every decision, every movement, and every social adjustment. People did not ask whether pain would come. They asked how long functionality could be preserved once it did. Daily life placed enormous strain on the body. Walking across frozen terrain stressed joints and tendons constantly. Carrying tools, food, children, and fuel overloaded muscles already working near their limit. Falls were common. Slips on ice, missteps on uneven ground, and sudden shifts in weight caused bruises, sprains, and fractures. Cuts from stone tools happened frequently. Even careful hands slipped when fingers were numb from cold. None of these injuries were treated as dramatic. They were treated as dangerous because of what followed. The true danger of injury was not immediate pain. It was loss of efficiency. A person who moved more slowly burned more energy. A person who limped could not regulate heat properly. Reduced mobility increased exposure to cold, which weakened the body further. Weakness increased the chance of additional injury. This chain reaction often unfolded quietly, over days or weeks, until survival was no longer possible. Many Ice Age deaths were not sudden. They were gradual failures of function. Pain itself was not avoided or suppressed. It was information. Ice Age people learned to listen to pain carefully. Pain indicated limits that had to be respected. Ignoring pain led to greater damage. However, resting completely was often impossible. Resting too long meant losing heat, circulation, and strength. The challenge was to move enough to stay functional without worsening injury. This balance defined daily behavior. Illness added another layer of danger. Without understanding bacteria or infection, people relied on observation and experience. Fever, confusion, weakness, and loss of appetite were recognized as warning signs. Illness reduced appetite at the exact moment when energy was needed most. A sick person struggled to keep warm, struggled to move, and struggled to contribute. The group responded immediately by adjusting pace, workload, and shelter arrangements. Care was practical rather than curative. Wounds were cleaned as best as possible. Dirt and debris were removed. Bleeding was controlled with pressure and binding. Limbs were stabilized to prevent further damage. Warmth was prioritized above all else. These actions did not heal injuries, but they slowed deterioration. Experience taught which injuries could be survived and which almost never were. Fractures were among the most feared injuries. A broken arm limited contribution, but could sometimes be managed. A broken leg was often a death sentence. Without mobility, a person could not regulate heat, gather food, or escape danger. Healing a broken leg required weeks of protection, warmth, and food. This placed enormous strain on the group. Some groups attempted it. Some succeeded. Many could not afford the cost. Chronic pain was common. Bodies were down early. Joints stiffened. Backs weakened from years of carrying weight. Teeth cracked or wore away, making eating painful and inefficient. These conditions accumulated over time. Survival did not require perfect health. It required adaptability. People with chronic pain shifted roles rather than withdrawing from life. They prepared tools, managed fire, watched children, or guided decisions using experience rather than strength. Infection was poorly understood but deeply feared. Certain wounds developed swelling, discoloration, heat, and foul odor. These signs were associated with death. Groups attempted to isolate such wounds, keeping them clean and warm. Some individuals survived. Many did not. When death came, it was rarely sudden. It unfolded gradually, and the group adjusted around it. Cold itself functioned as a form of injury. Frost damage numbed fingers and toes permanently. Sensation was lost. Dexterity declined. Faces scarred. These changes reduced efficiency and increased risk. Yet people adapted. Survival favored those who learned to work around limitation rather than expecting recovery. Psychological endurance was inseparable from physical endurance. Pain, weakness, and illness tested morale constantly. Individuals who responded to pain with panic or despair deteriorated faster. Emotional collapse often preceded physical collapse. Calm acceptance conserved energy. Groups reinforced emotional control through example rather than instruction. The presence of injury or illness reshaped group dynamics immediately. Tasks were reassigned. Pace slowed. Routes were altered. These decisions were not sentimental. They were survival calculations. Preserving a functional group mattered more than preserving comfort or fairness. Death from injury or illness was part of life. It was not hidden. It was not dramatized. Mourning was brief because survival demanded continuation. Loss was remembered, but it did not halt movement. This was the reality of bodily survival in the Ice Age. The human body was constantly failing in small ways. Survival depended not on avoiding damage, but on managing damage without losing function entirely. The people who endured were not those who avoided pain, but those who learned how to live with it. As time passed, the Ice Age body did not simply face sudden injury or brief illness. It also faced long decline. Aging was not a distant stage reserved for a few. It was a gradual accumulation of weakness, stiffness, and limitation that began early in adulthood. The environment accelerated wear. Cold tightened joints year after year. Heavy loads compressed spines. Repetitive motion ground cartilage away. Teeth wore down rapidly from coarse food, making eating slower, more painful, and less efficient. Aging in the Ice Age was not a separate life phase. It was a condition that merged into daily survival long before modern societies would consider someone old. Older individuals were not valued for physical output alone. Strength declined, but knowledge increased. Those who survived long enough to age held memory that younger members lacked. They remembered failed strategies, dangerous routes, harsh winters, and subtle environmental patterns that were not obvious to those with fewer years of experience. This memory shaped decision-making quietly. Elders were listened to not out of respect, but because experience improved survival odds. However, aging also brought risk. Reduced mobility slowed the group. Stiff joints limited endurance. Chronic pain altered posture and increased energy expenditure. Groups adapted by shifting roles. Older individuals prepared tools, managed fire, processed food, and guided decisions. Survival favored groups that could integrate reduced physical capacity without losing collective function. Long-term illness was especially dangerous. Unlike acute injury, chronic sickness drained energy continuously. A person weakened over weeks rather than days. Appetite declined. Strength faded. The body struggled to regulate temperature. These individuals required sustained support. The group faced constant calculation. How much support could be given without jeopardizing everyone? These decisions were among the most difficult in Ice Age life. Some long illnesses stabilized. People lived with reduced capacity for years. Others worsened slowly until death became inevitable. There was no concept of recovery timelines. Observation guided response. When someone could no longer contribute or even maintain their own warmth, the group adjusted around that reality. Not all individuals survived decline. Some were lost during migration. Some died quietly during winter nights. Others were buried deliberately when death occurred within shelter. These burials are among the few archaeological traces of Ice Age life. The bodies that remain today often belong to those who survived long enough to be cared for at the end of life. Survival left evidence. Sudden disappearance did not. Archaeological remains show healed fractures, worn joints, and advanced dental damage. These signs indicate that some individuals lived for years with significant physical impairment. This survival was not accidental. It required group support. It demonstrates that Ice Age societies were not purely ruthless. They balanced practicality with continuity. Preserving experience sometimes justified the cost. However, this care was not unlimited. The environment imposed limits that no social bond could overcome. During extreme scarcity, hard decisions were unavoidable. The group's survival always came first. This was not cruelty. It was reality. Psychological endurance became more important as the body weakened. Those who accepted limitation and adapted survived longer than those who resisted decline. Emotional collapse often preceded physical collapse. Despair reduced appetite, movement, and cooperation. Calm acceptance conserved energy. Death was not feared as an abstract concept. It was expected as part of life's arc. Fear focused on dying in a way that endangered others or wasted resources. Quiet deaths within shelter were preferable to sudden deaths during movement. The bodies that remain in the archaeological record tell a selective story. They represent those who survived long enough to be buried or preserved by environment. Many others left no trace at all. Survival was uneven. Evidence favors endurance. In this way, Ice Age survival was not only about strength or youth. It was about adaptability across the entire lifespan. Those who learned how to age within limitation endured longer than those who resisted it. The Ice Age did not reward perfection. It rewarded persistence. Life in the Ice Age was lived under a constant layer of threat that never fully lifted, no matter how experienced or skilled a group became. Danger was not an occasional interruption to normal life. It was the background condition of existence. People did not ask whether something bad might happen. They assumed that it could, at any moment, and organized their behavior around reducing the damage when it did. Every day began with awareness rather than confidence. Even familiar surroundings could change overnight. A shift in wind could reshape snowdrifts and hide dangerous ice. Animal patterns could alter suddenly, turning safe paths into hunting grounds. Weather could deteriorate without warning. This unpredictability meant that habits were never followed blindly. Attention remained active at all times. Movement itself was risky. Walking across frozen terrain demanded continuous micro-adjustments. Balance had to be recalibrated constantly. The body learned to distribute weight carefully, to avoid sudden shifts that could cause slips or falls. Hands were kept ready to brace against impact. A fall was never trivial. Even a minor injury could escalate into a survival crisis. Sound played a critical role in awareness. Cold air carried sound farther and clearer. People listened constantly. The crunch of snow under unfamiliar weight, the distant movement of animals, changes in wind tone, all of these were interpreted instinctively. Silence was not peaceful. It was information. Too much silence could signal danger as much as unexpected noise. Animals represented both resource and threat. Large animals could provide food, but they also posed danger if encountered unexpectedly. Predators avoided humans when possible, but hunger altered behavior. A weakened group, a sick individual, or the scent of food could attract attention. People never assumed safety simply because an area had been calm before. Shelter provided protection, but it was never absolute. Temporary structures could collapse under heavy snow. Fire could fail. Smoke could draw attention. Nights amplified every weakness. Darkness removed visual control and increased reliance on sound and memory. Sleep was never fully deep because awareness had to be maintained. The psychological cost of this constant vigilance was significant. Humans are not naturally suited to unbroken alertness, yet Ice Age life demanded it. Over generations, people adapted by narrowing focus. They learned to attend only to what mattered immediately. Long-term anxiety was replaced by short-term calculation. This adaptation prevented paralysis under stress. Fear existed, but it was controlled. Panic was dangerous because it disrupted coordination and decision-making. Emotional regulation was learned early and reinforced constantly. Children observed how adults responded to sudden danger without excessive movement or sound. Calm reactions preserved energy and reduced risk. Risk assessment was continuous. People evaluated terrain, weather, animal signs, and group condition before every action. Decisions were reversible whenever possible. Pride had no place in survival. Abandoning a plan was considered wisdom, not failure. Trust within the group was essential. Individuals relied on each other's judgment. A person who consistently misread danger endangered everyone. Over time, patterns of reliability emerged. Those who demonstrated accurate awareness influenced group behavior more strongly, regardless of age or strength. Injuries and illness increased vulnerability dramatically. A group carrying an injured member attracted attention and moved more slowly. This increased exposure to danger. Protective strategies were adjusted immediately. Routes were altered. Travel was limited. Night security increased. Survival demanded constant recalibration. Weather was perhaps the most unpredictable threat. Sudden storms could erase tracks, obscure landmarks, and trap groups in exposed areas. Wind chill intensified cold rapidly. People learned to recognize subtle warning signs and respond quickly. Delay was often fatal. Even moments of apparent safety required caution. Eating, resting, and social interaction were conducted with awareness of surroundings. Weapons were kept within reach. Fire was managed to balance warmth against visibility. Nothing was done casually. Over time, this continuous threat environment shaped behavior deeply. People became economical in movement, speech, and emotion. Efficiency was not taught. It was enforced by reality. Those who wasted energy or attention did not survive long. Despite this, Ice Age life was not lived in constant terror. Familiarity with danger reduced fear's intensity. Risk became normal. The mind adapted to function within uncertainty rather than resist it. This adaptation allowed humans to endure environments that would otherwise overwhelm them. Survival was never guaranteed, but it was possible through discipline, awareness, and cooperation. The Ice Age did not reward bravery or recklessness. It rewarded caution, memory, and restraint. This was the invisible labor of survival, the constant attention paid to what could go wrong, and the quiet adjustments made to prevent it. It defined daily life as much as hunger or cold. The longer Ice Age life continued under constant threat, the more deeply that threat shaped the human mind. Danger was no longer perceived as an event. It became a condition. This did not mean that people lived in constant fear, but it did mean that awareness never fully switched off. The mind remained partially alert even during moments of rest. This persistent vigilance altered how people thought, reacted, and related to one another. Sleep itself reflected this condition. People did not sleep deeply or continuously. Rest came in fragments, interrupted by shifts in temperature, sound, or movement. This pattern was not a defect. It was an adaptation. Deep, unconscious sleep increased vulnerability. Fragmented sleep allowed rapid response to danger. Over generations, the human body adapted to function under this rhythm, learning to recover without complete disengagement. Dreams, when they occurred, were brief and often intense. They reflected daily stress rather than imagination. However, dreams were not discussed extensively. Interpretation had no survival value. Waking awareness mattered more than inner experience. Attention returned immediately to the environment. Loss was a constant companion. Not dramatic loss, but quiet disappearance. Someone injured during movement did not recover. Someone weakened by illness did not wake. Someone lost during a storm was not found. These events were absorbed into routine. There was little space for prolonged mourning. Survival required forward movement. Memory of loss informed behavior rather than emotion. Children grew up witnessing this reality. They learned early that people could be present one day and gone the next. This did not make relationships shallow. It made them precise. Attachment was expressed through reliability rather than sentiment. Being dependable mattered more than verbal reassurance. Fear existed, but it was not indulged. Fear signaled risk. Once the risk was identified, fear had served its purpose. Prolonged fear wasted energy and attention. Groups reinforced calm behavior through example. Those who panicked endangered everyone and were corrected quickly. The environment itself acted as constant feedback. Every mistake had consequences. People learned which risks could be tolerated and which could not. This knowledge was practical, not abstract. Over time, individuals developed an internal sense of danger that guided behavior without conscious thought. Animals shaped psychological pressure as much as physical danger. Predators rarely attacked directly, but their presence was always felt. Tracks near camp, distant sounds, or altered animal behavior signaled risk. People responded by adjusting fire size, shelter placement, and night vigilance. Defense was subtle and continuous. Weather intensified mental strain. Storms erased familiar markers. Snowfall isolated groups. Wind amplified cold and sound. During severe weather, uncertainty peaked. People relied heavily on routine to maintain psychological stability. Familiar sequences of action provided control when the environment felt unpredictable. Decision-making under stress followed patterns refined over time. Quick decisions were made only when necessary. Otherwise, observation preceded action. This reduced error. Groups that rushed decisions suffered greater loss. Patience was not passive. It was strategic. Trust within the group was essential for psychological survival. Knowing that others would act predictably reduced mental load. Unreliable behavior increased stress and danger. Over time, social cohesion became a buffer against environmental threat. Even moments of apparent safety required caution. Eating, repairing tools, or talking near fire were done with awareness of surroundings. Weapons were kept within reach. Fire was monitored constantly. Nothing was allowed to drift into carelessness. Despite constant pressure, Ice Age people were not emotionally broken. The human mind adapted to sustained threat by narrowing focus. Attention centered on what could be controlled. Abstract worry faded. Immediate action replaced anxiety. This adaptation allowed endurance without collapse. Life was lived one cycle at a time, day to night, night to morning. Success was measured not in achievement, but in continuation. Waking again was enough. Over generations, this mental discipline became cultural. It shaped behavior, values, and social structure. Those who could not adapt did not persist. Those who did left traces in human ancestry. The Ice Age was not survived through strength alone. It was survived through attention. Attention to sound, movement, weather, behavior, and consequence. This constant, quiet vigilance defined daily life more than any single dramatic event. And it was this vigilance, unbroken, exhausting, and effective, that allowed human beings to exist in a world that never paused to accommodate them. Hunger in the Ice Age was not an event that arrived and then passed. It was the permanent condition against which all other experiences were measured. People did not describe themselves as hungry in the way modern language does, because hunger was assumed. It was the baseline state of the body. What mattered was not whether hunger existed, but how intense it had become and how long it had lasted. Daily life unfolded within this constant calculation. From the moment a person woke, the body was already managing scarcity. Energy reserves were low by default. Muscles were stiff from cold and underfueled. Movement began cautiously, not out of laziness, but because wasting energy early in the day reduced the chance of lasting until night. People learned to start the day slowly, warming the body gradually, allowing circulation to return without sudden exertion. This was not comfort. It was survival discipline shaped by hunger. Food availability never erased hunger completely. Even on days when food was found, eating did not create fullness in the modern sense. Portions were small, controlled, and strategic. Eating until satisfied meant eating into tomorrow's survival. The body might crave more, but the mind, trained by experience, resisted. Restraint was not moral. It was practical. The human body adapted to this condition over generations. Metabolism slowed. Fat storage became efficient when possible. Muscle mass was maintained only to the degree necessary for function. Excess bulk consumed energy and increased food demand. Ice Age bodies were shaped by scarcity into lean, efficient systems optimized for endurance rather than strength. Hunger altered perception in subtle but profound ways. Attention narrowed naturally. The mind became attuned to environmental signals related to food, tracks, broken branches, disturbed snow, changes in animal behavior. Other concerns faded. Conversation diminished. Emotional expression softened. Silence conserved energy and focus. Hunger shaped not only the body, but social behavior. Children grew up without the expectation of regular meals. They learned early that crying did not produce food. Instead, it drained energy and drew attention. Children observed adults enduring hunger without complaint and learned to do the same. This was not cruelty. It was adaptation. Emotional control conserved energy and reduced stress within the group. Periods of relative abundance were rare and fleeting. A successful hunt or gathering event did not transform daily life into comfort. Processing food required time, energy, and exposure. Preservation was limited by environment and technology. Much of the food had to be consumed quickly or risk loss to animals or spoilage. Even abundance carried stress. Fat was the most valued component of food, not for pleasure, but for survival. It provided dense energy and helped maintain body temperature. Protein alone could not sustain life in prolonged cold. Ice Age people learned this empirically. Those who consumed too little fat weakened rapidly, even if they ate large quantities of lean meat. This knowledge shaped food distribution carefully. Hunger influenced every decision about movement. A well-fed group could afford cautious exploration. A hungry group faced harsher choices. Risk tolerance shifted. Sometimes hunger forced bold action. Other times it demanded extreme restraint. Hunger was not just a physical sensation. It was a strategic variable that determined behavior. Social relationships were tested most severely during scarcity. Food sharing was never random. It followed survival logic. Children and those essential to the group's future were often prioritized. Strong adults endured longer periods of hunger because their bodies could tolerate it better. This imbalance was accepted because it improved overall survival chances. Starvation unfolded gradually. The body weakened in stages. Strength declined first, then coordination, then judgment. Mistakes increased. Cold tolerance dropped. Ice Age people recognized these stages intuitively. They knew when hunger had crossed from manageable to critical. At that point, decisions became urgent and sometimes irreversible. Chronic hunger reshaped the body over time. Bone density changed. Growth patterns adapted. Teeth wore down faster, making eating more difficult and reinforcing scarcity. These changes accumulated across generations, shaping physiology itself. Ice Age humans were not simply modern humans living without food. They were humans shaped by prolonged scarcity. Psychologically, hunger demanded adaptation. Constant desire without fulfillment could have produced despair. Instead, the mind adapted by lowering expectation. Satisfaction was redefined. Relief replaced pleasure. Surviving another day became enough. This mental shift prevented collapse under deprivation. Hunger also reinforced cooperation. Isolated individuals rarely survived long-term scarcity. Group sharing, even when minimal, improved survival odds. Trust mattered. Knowing that food would be shared when available reduced panic and impulsive behavior. Daily routines were structured to minimize energy loss. Movements were economical. Gestures were limited. Speech was measured. Nothing extraneous survived. Hunger acted as a filter, stripping behavior down to what mattered. This constant negotiation with scarcity defined Ice Age life more deeply than cold or danger alone. Cold could be managed with fire and clothing. Danger could be avoided with awareness. Hunger required continuous discipline. It never fully disappeared. Ice Age people did not live waiting for the next meal. They lived learning how to function without one. This ability, refined over generations, allowed humans to survive environments that offered little mercy. And it was this quiet endurance of hunger, persistent, controlled, and deeply integrated into daily life, that shaped the rhythm of existence more than any single dramatic moment. As hunger persisted not for days, but for lifetimes, the human body in the Ice Age underwent deep, long-term adaptation. This was not short-term deprivation followed by recovery. It was a continuous state that reshaped physiology, behavior, and expectation across generations. Bodies learned to survive on less not because they wanted to, but because those that could not simply did not endure. Metabolic efficiency became essential. The body reduced unnecessary expenditure wherever possible. Heart rate at rest slowed. Movements became smaller and more deliberate. Muscles were maintained only to the extent that they were useful. Excess muscle mass consumed energy without offering proportional benefit. Over time, bodies favored endurance and efficiency rather than explosive strength. This was not a conscious process. It was selection enforced by scarcity. Fat storage, when it occurred, was treated cautiously by the body. Periods of slight abundance allowed limited reserves to form, but these reserves were consumed quickly during lean times. The cycle repeated endlessly. The body learned not to rely on storage, but on conservation. Hunger trained the body to function at the edge of depletion without immediate collapse. Long-term hunger altered growth patterns. Children grew more slowly. Development stretched over longer periods. This reduced immediate energy demand and increased survival odds during prolonged scarcity. Short-term weakness was traded for long-term resilience. These changes were subtle but cumulative, shaping population-level traits over time. Hunger also influenced risk perception profoundly. A well-fed body can afford caution. A starving body faces narrowing options. Decisions that would seem reckless under normal conditions became necessary when energy reserves vanished. Groups sometimes took dangerous risks not because they misjudged danger, but because the alternative was certain decline. Hunger forced action even when outcomes were uncertain. Mental function was affected in predictable ways. Prolonged hunger reduced patience and narrowed attention. However, Ice Age people adapted by simplifying decision-making. Complex plans were avoided. Immediate, actionable choices were prioritized. This reduced cognitive load and preserved mental energy. The mind adapted just as the body did. Social behavior shifted under prolonged scarcity. Hierarchies flattened. Survival logic overrode preference. Those who contributed directly to food acquisition or essential tasks gained influence temporarily. Authority shifted fluidly based on immediate usefulness rather than status. Hunger reshaped social structure dynamically. Cultural memory preserved lessons about hunger. Stories, behaviors, and habits encoded strategies for endurance. Groups remembered places where starvation had occurred and avoided them when possible. They remembered timing, weather patterns, and mistakes. Memory acted as a secondary energy reserve, preventing repeated failure. Hunger also shaped morality in ways modern societies find difficult to interpret. Sharing was expected, but sharing was strategic. Compassion existed, but it operated within limits. Food given without calculation endangered everyone. These boundaries were understood implicitly. Emotional impulses were restrained by survival logic. Periods of extreme starvation tested these limits. Bodies weakened to the point where movement itself became dangerous. At this stage, survival often depended on chance, weather shifts, unexpected animal movement, or discovery of overlooked resources. Some groups survived these periods. Many did not. Hunger was an impartial force. Archaeological evidence reflects this uneven survival. Remains show signs of long-term malnutrition, interrupted growth, and metabolic stress. Yet they also show resilience. Individuals lived for years under conditions that would incapacitate modern bodies. Survival left traces in bone and tooth structure, revealing adaptation rather than collapse. Psychologically, prolonged hunger forced redefinition of success. Success was no longer measured by comfort or abundance. It was measured by continuity. Another day lived was achievement enough. This mental reframing prevented despair and maintained cohesion. Hunger also reinforced cooperation at its most basic level. Alone, survival was nearly impossible. Groups pooled effort, knowledge, and limited resources. Even minimal sharing improved odds. Trust reduced panic. Panic wasted energy. Importantly, hunger was never romanticized. It was endured, managed, and feared. People did not seek it. They adapted to it because adaptation was the only option. This realism prevented false hope and dangerous optimism. Over generations, this continuous relationship with scarcity shaped humanity itself. Bodies, minds, and social systems were refined under pressure. Traits that supported endurance persisted. Those that did not faded. The Ice Age was not survived because people found enough food. It was survived because people learned how to live without enough food for long periods without falling apart. Hunger was not a chapter in Ice Age life. It was the thread running through every chapter. It shaped movement, decision-making, cooperation, and identity. And it was this relentless, disciplined negotiation with scarcity that allowed human life to continue in a world that offered no guarantees. Sleep in the Ice Age was never a complete withdrawal from the world. It was not a state of safety or recovery in the modern sense. It was a controlled vulnerability, entered cautiously and exited easily. People did not sleep because they felt secure. They slept because the body could not continue without some degree of rest, even in an environment that never truly allowed it. From the moment night approached, the body began preparing not for rest, but for endurance. Movement slowed deliberately to conserve energy. Fire was managed carefully to provide warmth without excessive visibility. Shelter was adjusted to reduce wind exposure. These preparations were not rituals. They were practical adjustments shaped by experience. Poor preparation meant poor sleep, and poor sleep weakened the body the following day. Sleep positions were chosen with intention. People did not stretch out freely. Limbs were kept close to the body to reduce heat loss. Individuals slept near one another, not for comfort, but for shared warmth and security. Children were placed between adults. The sick or weak were positioned closest to fire or insulation. These arrangements reduced risk during the most vulnerable hours. The body never fully relaxed. Even during sleep, awareness remained partially active. Sounds were processed instinctively. Changes in wind, unfamiliar movement, or animal noise triggered immediate alertness. Waking was quick. There was no grogginess. Survival favored those who could transition rapidly from rest to action. Sleep came in fragments. People drifted in and out of consciousness repeatedly through the night. This was not considered a problem. It was normal. Deep, uninterrupted sleep increased vulnerability. Fragmented sleep allowed response. Over generations, the human body adapted to function under this rhythm, learning to recover without full disengagement. Cold shaped every aspect of rest. Body temperature dropped quickly during stillness. People adjusted coverings constantly, waking briefly to reposition hides, add insulation, or move closer to heat. Moisture was dangerous. Damp clothing or bedding increased heat loss dramatically. Dryness mattered as much as warmth. Dreams, if they occurred, were brief and intense. They reflected daily stress rather than imagination. However, dreams were not discussed extensively. Interpretation had no survival value. What mattered was waking alert and functional. Inner experience was secondary to external readiness. Chronic fatigue was part of life. People rarely felt fully rested. The body learned to function under continuous low-level exhaustion. Efficiency compensated for lack of recovery. Movements became economical. Gestures were minimized. Speech was measured. Energy conservation extended into every aspect of behavior. Rest during the day was strategic rather than restorative. Short pauses were taken to prevent collapse, not to refresh completely. Sitting too long increased cold exposure. Rest involved subtle movement to maintain circulation while reducing strain. The concept of leisure did not exist. Rest was survival maintenance. Illness and injury complicated sleep further. Pain disrupted rest. Fever altered temperature regulation. The sick slept more but recovered less. The group adjusted to protect them, but sleep remained fragmented. Recovery depended on function, not comfort. Psychologically, the lack of full rest shaped expectation. People did not anticipate waking refreshed. They anticipated waking capable. Success was measured by the ability to stand, move, and contribute again. Anything beyond that was unnecessary. Sleep routines were deeply ingrained. Familiar sequences of preparation reduced anxiety. Predictability provided control in an uncertain environment. These routines stabilized the mind even when the body remained tired. Over time, this pattern of rest shaped human resilience. The ability to endure fatigue without collapse became a survival trait. Those who required full recovery did not endure. Those who adapted persisted. Sleep in the Ice Age was not an escape from danger. It was a negotiated pause within it. Rest existed, but it was shallow, cautious, and conditional. And it was this restrained, adaptive approach to rest that allowed people to survive night after night in a world that never truly slept. As nights repeated without true recovery, the long-term effects of broken sleep shaped the Ice Age body and mind in profound ways. Chronic fatigue was not treated as a problem to be solved. It was accepted as the normal state of existence. The human system adapted not by eliminating exhaustion, but by learning how to function within it without breaking down entirely. This adaptation was gradual and unforgiving. Those who could not adjust simply did not last. Over time, the body learned to ration effort more precisely. Movements became smaller, smoother, and more deliberate. Sudden actions were avoided whenever possible because they consumed energy rapidly and increased the risk of injury. The body favored consistency over intensity. Even when strength was required, it was applied briefly and efficiently rather than explosively. This behavior conserved energy and reduced the need for full recovery. The nervous system adapted as well. Constant partial alertness reshaped perception. Ice Age people became highly sensitive to environmental changes without being overwhelmed by them. A slight shift in sound or temperature registered immediately, but did not trigger panic. This balance allowed survival in an environment where complete relaxation was dangerous. Awareness became background rather than focus, freeing mental space for action. Memory also changed under chronic fatigue. Rather than storing detailed narratives, the mind retained practical patterns. Which routes were safer? Which weather signs preceded storms? Which animal behaviors signaled danger? Memory was optimized for decision-making, not reflection. Forgetting unimportant detail reduced cognitive load. Emotionally, prolonged lack of rest reshaped expectation. Ice Age people did not measure well-being by how they felt. They measured it by functionality. If the body could move, think clearly enough, and respond to danger, the day was successful. Feeling good was irrelevant. This reframing prevented disappointment and despair. Expectations matched reality. Sleep deprivation also influenced social interaction. Conversation was brief and purposeful. Excess speech wasted energy and attention. Silence was comfortable, not awkward. Shared quiet did not signal tension. It signaled efficiency. This cultural comfort with silence reduced psychological strain. During extended periods of danger or scarcity, sleep became even lighter. People accepted this without complaint. Complaining served no purpose. The group adjusted routines instead. Night watch patterns shifted. Fire was managed more carefully. Shelter arrangements were altered to reduce disturbance. Adaptation replaced expectation. The long-term cost of this lifestyle was visible in the body. Aging accelerated. Joints stiffened earlier. Reflexes slowed. Yet endurance often increased. People could function under conditions that would incapacitate modern individuals. This endurance was not strength. It was tolerance. Children raised in this environment adapted naturally. Fragmented sleep was normal to them. They learned to rest whenever possible, in short intervals. Napping was not structured. It occurred opportunistically. The ability to recover quickly from brief rest became a skill learned early. Illness interacted dangerously with sleep deprivation. Fever disrupted already fragile rest. Weakness increased vulnerability. The group compensated by adjusting demands on the sick, but sleep remained imperfect. Recovery was slow and uncertain. Survival depended on preventing total collapse rather than restoring full health. Psychologically, the absence of deep rest narrowed emotional range. Extreme highs and lows were rare. Emotional moderation conserved energy. Calm persistence replaced excitement. This emotional flattening was not numbness. It was regulation. The mind learned not to overreact because overreaction was costly. Over generations, this pattern shaped human resilience. Those who required comfort, security, or full rest did not endure Ice Age conditions. Those who adapted to constant partial deprivation survived and reproduced. These traits became embedded in human behavior long after the Ice Age ended. Archaeological evidence supports this endurance. Skeletal remains show signs of chronic stress combined with long survival. People lived for decades under conditions of deprivation. They did not thrive. They endured. Endurance was enough. Sleep in the Ice Age was not restorative in the modern sense. It was functional. It allowed survival to continue without complete collapse. The body and mind learned to accept less, expect less, and operate within narrow margins. This adaptation explains how humans persisted in environments that offered no comfort and little safety. They did not wait for rest. They learned how to live without it. And in that relentless negotiation between exhaustion and awareness, human endurance was forged. Life in the Ice Age did not feel like a journey toward improvement. There was no sense of progress, no expectation that tomorrow would be easier than today. Survival was cyclical rather than linear. Each day repeated the same challenges in slightly different forms, and success was measured only by continuation. The concept of getting ahead did not exist. There was only the ability to remain. People did not wake with long-term plans. They woke with immediate priorities shaped by condition rather than ambition. Was the body functional enough to move? Was the group intact? Was there sufficient warmth to begin activity without burning through reserves too quickly? These questions defined the start of every day. Anything beyond them was irrelevant. Time itself was experienced differently. Without calendars or long-term security, the future compressed into manageable segments. Days were units. Nights were obstacles. Seasons were patterns remembered through experience rather than dates. This perception reduced psychological strain. Anxiety about distant outcomes had no survival value. Attention remained anchored to what could be acted upon. Ice Age life demanded constant adjustment rather than mastery. No skill was ever complete. A successful strategy one year could fail the next. Animal migrations shifted. Weather patterns changed. Landscapes transformed. Adaptability mattered more than expertise. Those who clung rigidly to past success were overtaken by changing conditions. The social world reflected this instability. Relationships were built on reliability rather than emotion. Trust was earned through consistent behavior under pressure. People depended on one another not because of shared ideals, but because isolation was fatal. Cooperation was not virtuous. It was necessary. Individual identity was shaped by contribution. A person was known by what they could do, how they behaved under stress, and how reliably they responded to danger. Status was fluid. Strength mattered when strength was needed. Knowledge mattered when decisions were required. Value shifted with circumstance. This fluidity prevented stagnation. Authority was not permanent. It was situational. The person best equipped to respond to a challenge guided action in that moment. When conditions changed, leadership shifted. This flexibility reduced conflict and increased survival odds. Despite constant hardship, Ice Age life was not lived in despair. Expectations were aligned with reality. People did not anticipate comfort, abundance, or security. Because these things were not expected, their absence did not produce constant disappointment. Satisfaction came from continuity rather than pleasure. Rituals, where they existed, were practical. They reinforced memory, behavior, and cohesion. They were not escapism. They were reminders of what mattered: caution, cooperation, and endurance. Anything that wasted energy or distracted from survival did not persist. Over time, this way of living shaped human behavior deeply. Traits that supported endurance under uncertainty were reinforced. Patience, restraint, awareness, and adaptability became embedded. These traits did not disappear when the Ice Age ended. They carried forward into later human societies, even as environments changed. The end of the Ice Age did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded gradually, unevenly, and unpredictably. Warmer conditions altered landscapes. New resources appeared. Old patterns lost relevance. For people adapted to scarcity and instability, abundance created new challenges. Skills refined for survival under pressure were not always suited to stability. Some groups adapted. Others disappeared. The Ice Age did not end because people failed. It ended because conditions changed. The survival strategies that once ensured endurance became unnecessary or inefficient. Human life reorganized itself around new realities. What remains remarkable is not how difficult Ice Age life was, but how long it persisted. Humans lived this way for tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation endured cold, hunger, danger, and uncertainty without collapsing. This endurance was not accidental. It was the result of constant adaptation. Modern life often imagines Ice Age people as primitive or incomplete. In reality, they were specialists in survival under extreme constraint. Their intelligence was not expressed through comfort or construction, but through restraint, awareness, and cooperation. The legacy of the Ice Age is not found only in tools or bones. It is found in human behavior. The ability to function under stress, to endure uncertainty, to cooperate when resources are scarce. These traits were forged in that world. Ice Age life was not about conquering nature. It was about negotiating with it continuously. Humans survived not by dominating their environment, but by learning its limits and staying within them. And when that world finally changed, humanity carried forward the lessons learned in cold, hunger, and vigilance. Lessons that continue to shape how people respond to hardship even now. As Ice Age life continued across countless generations, survival stopped being a temporary struggle and became a permanent framework for existence. People were born into hardship and learned its rules before they understood language fully. By the time an individual reached adulthood, endurance was not a skill they practiced. It was the only way they knew how to live. This familiarity with hardship changed how life itself was valued. Life was not seen as something to be enjoyed or fulfilled. It was something to be maintained. Each day carried weight because it demanded effort. The value of a person was not measured by dreams or aspirations, but by consistency. Someone who woke each day, contributed what they could, conserved energy, and avoided unnecessary risk was respected. Reliability mattered more than brilliance. The Ice Age did not encourage long-term personal ambition. Planning extended only as far as conditions allowed. People learned to think in adaptable horizons. If conditions were stable, planning extended cautiously. If conditions shifted, plans collapsed without regret. This flexibility prevented psychological breakdown. People did not cling to futures that might never arrive. Death was ever present, but it was not sensationalized. It was woven into life as an expected outcome rather than a feared anomaly. People feared dying in ways that endangered others or wasted resources more than death itself. Quiet deaths within shelter were preferable to sudden deaths during migration or exposure. This perspective removed some of death's terror and replaced it with practicality. Generational continuity mattered more than individual longevity. Children represented the future not symbolically, but biologically. Protecting them ensured continuation. Education was not formal. It occurred through observation, repetition, and correction. Children learned survival by living it daily. Mistakes were corrected early because mistakes later could be fatal. As environments slowly changed toward the end of the Ice Age, established survival patterns began to lose their certainty. Warmer conditions altered animal movement. Vegetation shifted. Landscapes that had been predictable for generations changed gradually but persistently. This created tension between memory and observation. Knowledge inherited from elders sometimes conflicted with new realities. Some groups adapted successfully. They adjusted strategies, explored new food sources, and modified movement patterns. Others struggled. Habits refined under cold and scarcity were not always suited to changing conditions. The same caution that once ensured survival could become hesitation when opportunity appeared. This transition was not smooth or universal. There was no single moment when Ice Age life ended. Different regions experienced change differently. Some communities retained Ice Age patterns long after others adapted. Survival diverged. The people who adapted did not abandon endurance. They redirected it. Skills forged under scarcity were applied to new challenges. Cooperation, restraint, and awareness remained valuable even as conditions softened. The Ice Age did not disappear from human behavior. It receded into background influence. Looking back, it is easy to misinterpret Ice Age life as incomplete or lacking. This judgment reflects modern expectations rather than historical reality. Ice Age people did not fail to achieve comfort. Comfort was not the goal. Survival within constraint was. And by that measure, they succeeded for an extraordinary length of time. The endurance required to live this way reshaped humanity itself. Bodies adapted, minds adapted, social structures adapted. Traits that allowed humans to function under constant uncertainty became deeply embedded. These traits did not vanish with environmental change. They remain visible in how humans respond to stress, scarcity, and risk today. The Ice Age also reminds us that human resilience is not built through abundance. It is built through adaptation. People learn how to endure not when life is easy, but when life offers no alternatives. This endurance is quiet. It does not announce itself. It accumulates over time. What ultimately ended Ice Age life was not failure, but transformation. The world changed. Humans changed with it. The old rules became unnecessary, and new ones emerged. But the capacity to endure, learned through cold nights, hunger, vigilance, and restraint, remained. In this way, the Ice Age was not a primitive prelude to human history. It was a foundational chapter. It shaped how humans think, cooperate, and survive. Its influence extends far beyond frozen landscapes and ancient bones. The people who lived through it were not waiting for a better world. They lived fully within the one they had, adjusting continuously, enduring quietly, and passing forward what worked. And that quiet endurance, more than any tool or discovery, is the true legacy of life in the Ice Age. When we imagine life in the Ice Age, it is tempting to focus on extremes, the cold, the danger, the constant struggle to survive. Yet what truly defined daily life was not crisis, but continuity. People did not live waiting for catastrophe, nor did they expect comfort. They lived within narrow margins, adjusting constantly to a world that offered little stability and no guarantees. Ice Age survival was not built on strength alone. It depended on restraint, awareness, and cooperation. Individuals learned how to conserve energy, how to read subtle environmental signals, and how to act without wasting effort. Social life was shaped not by ideals, but by necessity. Reliability mattered more than ambition. Adaptability mattered more than certainty. Hunger, fatigue, danger, and uncertainty were not interruptions to life. They were the conditions under which life unfolded. Over generations, humans adapted physically and psychologically to function within these limits. Bodies became efficient. Minds learned to narrow focus. Emotions were regulated to conserve energy rather than express excess. What allowed Ice Age people to endure was not hope for a better future, but acceptance of the present. They did not measure success by improvement or progress. They measured it by continuation. Waking up again was enough. Surviving another cycle of day and night was enough. This way of living persisted for tens of thousands of years. It was not fragile. It was resilient. It did not collapse under pressure because it was shaped by pressure. The Ice Age did not defeat humanity. It shaped it. When conditions eventually changed, humans did not abandon the lessons learned in cold and scarcity. Those lessons carried forward, influencing how people respond to hardship even today. The capacity to endure uncertainty, to cooperate under stress, and to adapt without guarantees was forged long before comfort became possible. The Ice Age reminds us that human resilience is quiet. It does not announce itself through triumph. It exists in persistence, discipline, and adjustment. It exists in the ability to live fully within constraint. And that endurance, steady, uncelebrated, and effective, is what allowed humanity to continue when the world offered nothing freely.